Oyster shells into Charlotte Harbor today to help boost water quality and help our fish and anglers.
Florida dumped nearly 500,000 tons of oyster shells into the Gulf of Mexico. What happened afterward stunned researchers. These weren't carefully arranged according to some massive engineering plan. They were simply discarded shells, collected from seafood boils and processing facilities, loaded onto barges, and released into the Gulf off Florida's coastline between 2007 and 2024. At the time, nobody expected anything extraordinary. Environmental critics called it nothing more than ocean dumping disguised as conservation. Commercial fishermen who had spent decades working those waters feared it would ruin what remained of Florida's already struggling coastal seafloor. Even the scientists leading the project believed they might be witnessing an expensive failure. But then, something began happening beneath the Gulf's surface that overturned every prediction, every timeline, and every assumption about how fast nature could heal. A barren stretch of ocean floor started coming back to life, not gradually, not after years of monitoring, but faster, richer, and far more complex than any scientific model had ever imagined. What formed wasn't just another reef, it became a flourishing ecosystem that is still expanding today. This is exactly how it happened, and why it could completely change the way you see the ocean forever. The experiment nobody believed. From 2007 to 2024, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission carried out one of the most debated coastal experiments in the state's history. The idea sounded almost too simple to believe. Gather discarded oyster shells from restaurants and seafood processing facilities across Florida, transport them to the coast, load them onto barges, drop them into the Gulf of Mexico near Cedar Key. More than 500,000 tons in total. The criticism came immediately and from every side. Environmental groups called it a waste disposal project disguised as conservation. They warned the shells would bury the delicate marine communities still holding on beneath the soft, sandy seafloor. Coastal fishermen who had spent generations learning those waters, families who understood every tide and every seasonal shift, feared disturbed sediment, ruined fish habitats, and lasting damage to the fishing grounds that supported their livelihoods. This wasn't a small group of critics. It was a well-organized, respected opposition driven by real environmental concerns from people who truly understood these waters. Even so, the commission pressed ahead. Their reasoning was straightforward. Those oyster shells were headed to landfills anyway. If there was even a real chance they could become the foundation for restoring a damaged reef system, then the experiment was worth the political risk. Here's the part most people never mention. Nobody, not the program's designers, not the marine biologists reviewing the plan, not the fisheries managers who approved it, actually believed things would happen this fast. When the first monitoring teams returned to the shell drop sites 18 months after the initial deposits, they fully expected the results to prove the critics had been right all along. Instead, what they discovered left Dr. Krimsky, a shellfish habitat specialist with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, speechless in the middle of a team briefing. Life was spreading across the shell mounds, not after 2 or 3 years, which is the usual minimum timeline for any noticeable biological response from an artificial reef project, but within months. Marine organisms were gathering at speeds unlike anything previously documented in scientific research. The shells weren't acting like lifeless debris resting on the seafloor. They were becoming biological catalysts, setting off natural processes the surrounding environment couldn't start by itself. And no one could fully explain why it was happening so quickly. To understand the reason, you had to look at something so tiny it was almost impossible to see with the naked eye. What was happening beneath the surface was far more surprising than anyone expected. The invisible phase. Microscopic life that rebuilt an ecosystem. The first settlers weren't fish. They weren't oysters. They weren't even visible from a research boat. They were bacteria. Within days of the shells reaching the seafloor, microscopic bacterial communities spread across the calcium carbonate surfaces, creating thin biofilms, living layers that turned lifeless shells into thriving microhabitats. These weren't random collections of microbes. They formed an organized biological foundation that every other species would eventually depend on. The shells themselves were also doing something scientists hadn't fully expected. Oyster shells are made mostly of aragonite, a crystal form of calcium carbonate that slowly dissolves in seawater. As the shells released calcium ions into the surrounding water, they created tiny alkaline zones, microscopic chemical pockets within the Gulf's larger ecosystem. Those subtle chemical changes provided exactly what calcifying organisms needed to attach and begin growing. Barnacles, tubeworms, young oysters, species that require a precise chemical signal before settling onto a surface. The shells were creating that signal. They weren't simply offering a place to grow, they were building the perfect conditions for life to take hold. Weeks later, diatoms and microalgae soon settled into those established biofilms, creating the first layer of a simple food web. Tiny crustaceans and young mollusks arrived next, feeding on the algae. Those grazers then attracted the first juvenile fish. Every stage supported the next, forming a self-sustaining cycle that grew from discarded oyster shells resting on the dark floor of the Gulf. Here's why that matters. Sandy seafloors simply can't support this process. Sand provides no solid surface for biofilms to attach, no chemical microenvironments, and no structural complexity. Florida's soft-bottom Gulf floor had become trapped in an ecological dead end. The oyster shells completely bypassed that barrier. By the end of the first 6 months, their surfaces were covered with biofilms and microalgae. To anyone looking from above or even diving at the sites, it appeared to be a failure. Just a pile of old shells lying on a flat seafloor, slowly fading gray. But Dr. Krimsky's water samples and sediment cores revealed a completely different reality. In less time than most artificial reef projects show any measurable biological change, the shell deposits had already created a complete, working microscopic ecosystem. This invisible stage was the hidden framework. Without the bacteria, without the aragonite chemistry, and without the biofilms feeding the first wave of grazers, there would be no reef. There would only be calcium resting on sand. The foundation was already complete. What happened next forced scientists to rethink everything they believed about how reefs are formed. The return of the reef builders. Oysters need hard surfaces to survive. That single biological requirement had been quietly holding back Florida's Gulf Coast for decades, and most people never realized it. Oyster larvae, known as spat, drift through ocean currents searching for a solid surface to settle on. In a healthy reef, that surface comes from the accumulated shells of earlier generations. Over centuries, dead oyster shells build into a dense, complex reef that filters water, reduces erosion, and provides habitat for nearly 300 different species. But Florida's natural reefs had been devastated. Years of over-harvesting, pollution, coastal development, and polluted runoff had steadily destroyed a reef network that once stretched across hundreds of square miles of the Gulf. By the early 2000s, oyster spat floated through open water with almost nowhere to settle. No surface meant no settlement. No settlement meant no new oysters. The natural cycle had broken. The Gulf could no longer repair itself. The discarded shells removed that obstacle almost immediately. Each shell mound became a concentrated landing area, placed, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by the movement of Gulf currents, right where drifting oyster larvae would pass. Within the first year, Dr. Bill Pine, a marine researcher at the University of Florida Marine Lab, recorded juvenile oysters attaching to the deposited shells in numbers far beyond the project's original expectations. The larvae had found a place to settle. They began growing. By the second year, those young oysters had become reproductive adults, producing larvae of their own. That next generation settled onto the growing reef and expanded it even further. People created the starting point. Nature handled everything after that. By the third year, the data told an incredible story. Monitoring surveys found an average of 847 oysters per cubic meter of deposited shells. Nearby sandy seafloor without shells supported almost none. The reefs had also spread well beyond the original shell deposits. As oysters naturally died, their shells became part of the growing structure, creating fresh surfaces for the next generation to settle. The reef expanded upward and outward. It was now building itself. Then came the moment that completely changed public opinion about the project. Charter Captain Mike Lenz had been one of the strongest and most outspoken critics of the shell deposition program from the very beginning. He had testified against it before state officials. He had repeatedly warned that it would ruin the fishing grounds his family had relied on for 3 generations. Then, in 2013, standing on the deck of his boat above one of the established reef sites, Lenz watched a massive school of redfish holding steady in the current around a mound of oyster shells. Then he admitted something he never expected to say. "I was wrong. In 25 years on these waters, I've never seen fish gather like that." That moment wasn't just one man changing his opinion. It marked the point where scientific evidence and the first-hand experience of lifelong fishermen finally came together. And the fish were only the first sign of what these reefs were about to accomplish. When the fish arrived, everything changed. Reef fish don't wait for official reports. The moment structural complexity appears on an otherwise empty seafloor, they find it. Within 2 years of the Cedar Key reefs becoming established, fish surveys produced results so surprising that Dr. Pine's team reviewed their methods from the ground up. Fish biomass around the reef sites had increased by more than 340% compared to nearby control areas of the same size. Species diversity had climbed by 280%. Here's what made those numbers so remarkable. These weren't fish simply moving from another part of the Gulf because they had found a new habitat. The biggest increase came from juvenile fish. Young fish born in those waters that were surviving long enough to reach adulthood. The reefs weren't just gathering an existing population. They were creating conditions that allowed entirely new life to thrive. Redfish arrived first, using the maze of shells for food and protection from predators. Sheepshead followed, feeding on the thriving invertebrate communities covering every hard surface. Flounder settled along the reef edges. Snook returned in numbers that hadn't been recorded in those waters for years. Mike Lenz wasn't the only captain who changed his view. Charter operators throughout the Cedar Key region eventually began asking the very same commission they had challenged in court 6 years earlier to build new reef sites near their most popular fishing grounds. Hotels, bait shops, and waterfront restaurants also reported noticeable increases in business, directly linked to the growing marine activity around the reefs. The ecological chain kept climbing. Octopuses claimed homes inside the reef's cracks and crevices. Sea turtles returned to feed on the invertebrates covering the shells. Dolphins were seen hunting along the reef edges, working together to target the dense schools of fish. Every new species strengthened the food web beneath it. Season after season, the ecosystem became more diverse, more stable, and more resilient. What made this scientifically important, rather than simply impressive to watch, was a key difference Dr. Pine's team carefully documented in their published research. Traditional artificial reefs built from concrete structures or sunken ships are usually good at gathering fish already living nearby, simply pulling existing populations toward a new location. That can produce dramatic survey results without actually increasing marine life. The fish move, but no new fish are created. The Cedar Key reefs were doing something entirely different. The rise in biomass was driven mainly by juvenile fish. These reefs were producing new generations, creating survival conditions that had never existed in that ecosystem before. That difference was critical in shaping how Florida's fisheries managers viewed the future of the program, but the fish were only one part of the story. Something else was changing beneath the surface, something no scientific model had predicted. Something with effects reaching far beyond the reefs themselves, the billion-gallon machines that kept building. A single adult oyster filters 30 to 50 gallons of seawater every day. Multiply that by the hundreds of thousands of oysters thriving across the restored reefs, and the result is staggering. Entire reef systems were filtering billions of gallons of Gulf water each day. removing suspended particles, excess nutrients, harmful bacteria, and agricultural runoff. No machines, no power supply, and no maintenance costs. Nature had built a massive water filtration system using nothing more than discarded oyster shells from restaurants. For decades, nutrient pollution has been one of the Gulf Coast's biggest environmental challenges. Nitrogen and phosphorus from farms and urban development constantly flow into coastal waters, fueling harmful algal blooms that cloud the water, suffocate marine life, and sometimes cause massive fish kills. The oyster reefs tackled that problem at its source. Within just a few years, water around the reef sites became noticeably clearer. Dissolved oxygen levels increased. Nutrient levels dropped. And the improvements didn't stay limited to the reefs, they gradually spread outward in every direction. Cleaner water allows more sunlight to reach deeper depths. Seagrass, which provides essential habitat for juvenile fish, manatees, and sea turtles, depends on that sunlight to survive. As the reefs improved water clarity, seagrass returned to areas where murky conditions had kept it from growing for years. Then another positive cycle began. The seagrass stabilized the seafloor, reduced sediment in the water, improved clarity even further, and allowed even more seagrass to grow. Two natural feedback loops were now working together, creating benefits far beyond the areas where the shells had originally been placed. Researchers estimated that between 2007 and 2024, the reefs provided water filtration services worth tens of millions of dollars in ecological value. Nature delivered all of it for free. The success quickly spread beyond Florida. Alabama launched its own oyster shell recycling program by 2015. Mississippi followed. Louisiana began large-scale reef restoration projects of its own. The Billion Oyster Project in New York Harbor adopted the same approach in one of North America's most heavily damaged urban waterways. Reusing waste materials as working ecological infrastructure, a concept known as circular environmental design, was transforming conservation projects around the world. Coastal engineers from Canada, Australia, and across Europe started studying the Cedar Key results, but one final test remained, one no one had planned for and no one could control. September 2017. Hurricane Irma, a Category 4 storm. Winds topping 150 miles per hour. Devastating storm surge. Waves powerful enough to erase beaches and reshape coastlines within hours. When assessment teams surveyed the damage after Irma passed, they found something that left everyone stunned. Shorelines protected by the restored oyster reefs had suffered 30 to 40% less erosion than nearby sandy beaches. The reef's dense, uneven, three-dimensional structure absorbed and weakened incoming waves before they could strike the shore with full force. No moving parts. Just natural resistance. Less energy. Better protection. Engineers estimated the reefs prevented nearly $3 million in coastal property damage during Hurricane Irma alone. The entire 15-year restoration program had cost about $5 million. In a single storm, the reefs had nearly paid for themselves. Seawalls eventually crack, rock barriers shift, steel rusts, concrete wears out. Oyster reefs rebuild themselves. Storm damage creates fresh space for new oyster larvae to settle. Every generation adds more height and complexity to the reef. Instead of becoming weaker after each storm, the barrier grows stronger. Traditional shoreline protection often costs hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars per mile. The Cedar Key reefs delivered similar protection for a fraction of that cost while improving naturally year after year without extra investment. And the most remarkable chapter was still being written. By the early 2020s, the reefs had expanded far beyond the areas where the shells were first dumped, all on their own with no human help. The oldest reef sites had nearly doubled in size, powered entirely by the oyster's natural reproductive cycle. Each generation settled, matured, died, and left behind shells that became the foundation for the next. The reefs kept growing upward and outward, building themselves according to a timeline that no engineer or scientist had ever planned. The first shell deposits were nothing more than uneven piles of loose calcium carbonate. But the living reefs that developed became incredibly complex. They formed vertical layers, sheltered channels, overhangs, and dozens of unique microhabitats where crabs, octopuses, sea stars, and juvenile fish all used different parts of the same reef. They weren't simply sharing the same surface, they were living within a complete ecosystem. Healthy oyster reefs also capture organic carbon inside their shells and the surrounding sediments, locking away greenhouse gases that might otherwise contribute to ocean acidification and global warming. Almost unexpectedly, what began as an ecological restoration project also became a climate solution. At the most mature Cedar Key reef sites, biodiversity levels were approaching those found in untouched natural limestone reefs. Endangered sea turtles had returned. Dolphins were once again hunting along the reef edges in coordinated groups. The Gulf was rebuilding itself around the oysters, while the oysters continued rebuilding the Gulf. Every oyster that lived and died added new shell material for the next generation. Each generation expanded the reef, filtered more water, protected more shoreline, and supported even more marine life. Human involvement had ended. The ecosystem kept growing on its own. Scientists now project that this process could continue for decades, possibly even centuries. 500,000 tons of discarded oyster shells were thrown away, dismissed as waste, and dumped into the Gulf with no guarantee they would accomplish anything. Within days, bacteria settled across their surfaces. Aragonite chemistry began reshaping the surrounding water. Biofilms fed the first grazers. Young oysters found solid ground and settled. Generation after generation expanded the reef without any further human help. Fish arrived, followed by sea turtles, then dolphins hunting along the reef edges in coordinated groups. Water became clearer. Seagrass returned to areas where it had been absent for years. A Category 4 hurricane put the reefs to the ultimate test, and they held strong, then grew even stronger afterward. The restoration project ended. The ecosystem continued building itself. So the question is, should every damaged coastline around the world try this approach? Or is the Gulf about to reveal challenges that no one has discovered yet? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Nature Mystery Unravel Mysteries, learn untold tales of history, and stay in the exciting world of new discoveries.